Let's take a look at a longer example of these operators in action. Imagine we're writing a program that validates a credit card scan. This would be part of a longer program. That's why we have these ... dots at the beginning and end. That's just my way of saying this is part of a larger segment of code. To validate a credit card scan, our code would need to go through a number of different checks. It must check that the balance is sufficient to cover the total. It must check that the cardholder is the person trying to make the purchase. And it must check that the transaction is occurring at a trusted vendor. So what would that look like in code? Now, this is the longest and most complex chunk of code we've seen so far, so don't let it intimidate you. Learning to understand code that you can't fully read is a valuable skill. Note first, like I mentioned, that this is a part of some larger segment of code. So we have some variables: transaction amount, account balance, customer name, cardholder name, vendor, and trusted vendors. And we would assume that those were defined somewhere earlier in our code. We also see some functions: accept transaction and reject transaction. We don't see those defined here, but because they're highlighted in purple and bolded, we assume that they're defined somewhere. This is why self-documenting code is so valuable. Even though we don't know how most of this works, we haven't covered if statements and elses and things like that quite yet, we can kind of just read this code and figure out what it does. We can interpret the phrase if transaction amount is less than account balance as in some way checking to see whether or not there's enough money in the account to actually make the transaction. If the amount of the transaction is less than the account balance, then yes, there is sufficient money. We can also interpret if customer name equals cardholder name as doing something similar. We might assume that these are two strings representing names, and this checks to make sure that the person making the purchase is the same as the person holding the card. And similarly, if vendor in trusted vendors, we can probably infer that trusted vendors is a list of places that we trust, and vendor is the current vendor where this purchase is happening. If the current vendor is a trusted vendor, then we might approve the transaction. Now, this code is built around some conditional statements, which we'll cover next chapter. For now, though, just note that lines 2, 3, and 4 each use a different relational operator: less than, equals, and in. The first checks a relative numeric value, the second checks non-numeric equality, and the third checks set membership.